Hey everybody, and welcome to Dear Mr. Potter. It feels like it's been a minute since we gathered here to talk about Harry Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens, and over the course of the next 12 weeks, we are going to discuss Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, as well as the 2004 movie adaptation. We'll talk about that in our final session. I'm really excited for this, you guys. It has been a long time since I've talked about Harry Potter. It has been a long time since we all gathered together, but I think I speak for most of us here when I say that Prisoner of Azkaban is our favorite Harry Potter book. It is certainly my favorite Harry Potter movie. I have been looking forward to this discussion since starting Dear Mr. Potter. I've made no secret of the fact that the first two books in the series are not my favorites. I think that it takes Rowling a little while to grow into the magnitude of her story, and we are going to see that happen in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban. Guys, it is so good to have you all here. There are so many of you here tonight. Good Lord, it's going to be tough keeping up with the YouTube chat. You can, if you are watching live, interact in the little YouTube chat window right next to the video, or you can interact on Twitter, either as the video is live or in the days and weeks to come, using the hashtag Dear Mr. Potter, DEARMRPOTTER, or you can head on over to the Patreon, to the Point North Patreon exclusive Discord channel, the Discord common room, where we can hang out and talk about Dear Mr. Potter there. You can get access to that by heading on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia and pledging your support to help me do more of this and make more things for the internet. So I'm obviously very excited to talk about Prisoner of Azkaban. This is my favorite book. I would also possibly argue that it is the best book, and those two things are not necessarily synonymous. I think this is, in some sense, the best fusion of the two stories that J.K. Rowling is telling in the course of the Harry Potter series, and it marks a major turning point in the tone of the arc as a whole. This is the moment where Harry's adventures take on a more adult and consistent and ambitious tone, and not coincidentally, this is the book that marks the point at which Harry's personal experience of the wizarding world starts to connect out into the broader wizarding world, beyond the walls of Hogwarts. We're not yet expanding the scope of Harry's adventures as much as we will, but this is where it begins. In this first session tonight, as we look at the first two chapters, we're going to be paying a lot of attention to J.K. Rowling's tone and to the ways in which we are introduced and reintroduced to Harry's world and our core cast of characters. What we get in these opening chapters, I think, is a masterful bit of reframing, a masterful pivot away from the tone of Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets. Through numerous details and shifts in perspective, we are attuned, almost subconsciously attuned to this new version of Harry's life and, of course, to the broader wizarding world, all before we get to Hogwarts, which is a pretty impressive achievement. And that, of course, also provides us with a foundation for the rest of the book. And in this book, we are going to meet many of the core elements that will become absolutely pivotal in the arc of the Harry Potter series as a whole. We get in this book the introduction of boggarts, and we get the introduction of animagi, and we get the introduction of dementors. And, you know, the Patronus is introduced in this book. That's a pretty big deal. It also has what is, for me, one of the most complex plot constructions that we'll see in the series as a whole. And when I say complex, I don't mean complicated. This is crafted. This is beautifully done. This thing is constructed like a Swiss watch, or, hey, like a time turner. We've got a lot to discuss, basically, is what I'm saying. And we're about to get started. It's about to get so much more complicated and wonderful, says Raina in the YouTube chat. Yeah, you guys, we've got a lot to cover. If you are going to shout out questions in the YouTube chat, good Lord, there's a decent chance that I'm going to miss them. So tag me using the @PointNorthMedia, and that will at least highlight it in the YouTube chat. I can't promise that I'll get to everything. We have a number of slides to cover this week. And these chapters, well, it's not fair, I think, to say that Prisoner of Azkaban puts its worst foot forward. I do think that these two chapters are the least engaging in the book as a whole. It takes us some time to get into this book, but as I'm going to argue in tonight's session, that seems to be purposeful. We are changing our understanding of Harry Potter, which is one thing for those of us who are reading this series as adults, critically studying the series as adults. It's quite another for the intended juvenile audience of the series back when the books were originally being released. If you picked up Prisoner of Azkaban on the day of its release, then you had no idea what was to come. And the introduction into a darker and more thematically ambitious, thematically rich version of Harry Potter's experience, I think that that transition takes a little negotiating. So I'm going to argue tonight that actually, while we as adult readers of Harry Potter, while those of us who are reading this book for the third, fourth, fifth, 50th time will perhaps be a little less engaged by, for example, Aunt Madge, I mean, all of that is necessary. All of that is an example of this book teaching us how to read it and teaching us what to expect. Aaron says in the YouTube chat, the first 2 chapters pulled me right in. I was all about feeling serious and reading books too late and hating aunts. Yes, it's feeling serious, I should say, not feeling serious. 2 very different ideas. We'll pick up with the latter of those 2, I guess, in a few chapters' time. Good. All right. Let's get into it then with our first slide. We begin with chapter 1, The Owl Post. And this is our introduction, our reintroduction to Harry. Harry Potter was a highly unusual boy in many ways. For one thing, he hated the summer holidays more than any other time of year. For another, he really wanted to do his homework, but was forced to do it in secret in the dead of night. And he also happened to be a wizard. It was nearly midnight, and he was lying on his stomach in bed, the blankets drawn right over his head like a tent, a flashlight in one hand and a large leather-bound book, A History of Magic by Matilda Bagshot, propped open against the pillow. Harry moved the tip of his eagle feather quill down the page, frowning as he looked for something that would help him write his essay. Witch burning in the 14th century was completely pointless. Discuss. The quill paused at the top of a likely-looking paragraph. Harry pushed his round glasses up the bridge of his nose, moved his flashlight closer to the book, and read. Non-magic people, more commonly known as muggles, were particularly afraid of magic in medieval times, but not very good at recognizing it. On the rare occasion that they did catch a real witch or wizard, burning had no effect whatsoever. The witch or wizard would perform a basic flame-freezing charm and then pretend to shriek with pain while enjoying a gentle, tickling sensation. Indeed, Gwendolyn the Weird enjoyed being burned so much that she allowed herself to be caught no less than 47 times in various disguises. Right from the jump, we get a pivot away from our expectation here, this expectation that we have carried with us into this third book. And it's worth noting, too, that there is, for all that we get an active reintroduction of Harry, of Ron, of Hermione, of Hagrid, for all that these characters are brought back into our lives, there is almost no concession made here to the first-time reader. And that is, I think, as it should be, because one of the great accomplishments of J.K. Rowling's work is that she has legitimately, actually written a series. These books are not fungible. They are not easily replaceable with each other or with books from a different series. This is not a disconnected collection of novels which happen to take place in the same world. They really do functionally build upon one another, though it may well be argued that in most of the ways which are most meaningful, that begins now. That begins here. That begins with Azkaban. Look at that introduction that we get to Harry. Harry Potter was a highly unusual boy in many ways. Okay, that's our premise. That's our thesis statement. That is our introduction. He is a highly unusual boy. For one thing, he hated the summer holidays more than any other time of year. Clearly, the implication is boys in general love the summer holidays. I don't think we have any problem with that. For another, he really wanted to do his homework, but was forced to do it in secret in the dead of night. By implication, boys do not want to do their homework, and particularly don't want to do it in the dead of night. And he also happened to be a wizard. This, I think, is the first example of what I'm going to describe as this purposeful pivot. We are de-emphasizing Harry's nature. We are de-emphasizing his role as a wizard, which is, genuinely funny. That is very dry, that is very subtle. It works really rather beautifully. But much more importantly, it frames Harry as a boy first and a wizard second. And that hasn't always been the case. Harry's juvenile experience within the frame of the first 2 books has most often been superseded by his wizard experience. That is to say that, for those of you who didn't read or didn't catch the first 2 seasons of Dear Mr. Potter, I talked a lot about the contrast and oftentimes conflict between the fantasy story of Harry Potter and the juvenile boarding school adventure of Harry Potter. Those 2 threads, those 2 strands entwine with each other beautifully, but often to pull against each other. And in the first 2 books, one was clearly ascendant and one was de-emphasized. It was a fantasy story, first and foremost. But this is our first signal that actually Harry the person, Harry the human, Harry the boy is going to be more important in the course of Prisoner of Azkaban than Harry the wizard. We are going to connect more directly with his emotional experience, with his transformational experience, with his quintessentially adolescent experience than we are with the mechanics of wizardry and magic. And that's all to the good. That's vitally important. Micah Thor asks a very important question here in the YouTube chat. So what happens after the witch has been burned at the stake? Do they just apparate out of there? Yeah, we don't really cover the end result of this. Presumably at some point the flames go out and everyone gets bored and goes home, but you would presumably notice that the witch or wizard in question had not, burned to death. It's a good question. More importantly, though, in this opening section, in this opening passage, we get a sense of what wizard studies is like. This is our primary reintroduction to Harry's education, to the mechanism of that education. This is a dry and somewhat wry textbook. It's just like the history textbook that you read in high school or the geography textbook that you read in middle school. We are deglamorizing the world of witchcraft and wizardry. Even the way that the charm is referenced here. The witch or wizard would perform a basic flame-freezing charm and then pretend to shriek with pain while enjoying a gentle tickling sensation. There's no drama there. Quite the opposite, in fact. We drain the drama out of it. We drain the drama out of it so much that we make a joke. Indeed, Wendell the Weird enjoyed being burned so much that she allowed herself to be caught no less than 47 times in various disguises. Again, very dry, very wry, and absolutely on point for the educational experience that Harry is going to have when he returns to Hogwarts. Once again, we get, yes, as Raina says in the YouTube chat here, making the whimsical mundane. And by contrast, we are making the mundane grotesque. We'll see that, in fact, in the very next slide as we move into our description of the Dursley family. The Dursley family of number 4 Privet Drive was the reason that Harry never enjoyed his summer holidays. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and their son Dudley were Harry's only living relatives. They were muggles, and they had a very medieval attitude toward magic. Harry's dead parents, who had been a witch and a wizard themselves, were never mentioned under the Dursleys' roof. For years, Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had hoped that if they kept Harry as downtrodden as possible, they would be able to squash the magic out of him. To their fury, they had been unsuccessful. These days, they lived in terror of anyone finding out that Harry had spent most of the last 2 years at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The most they could do, however, was to lock away Harry's spellbooks, wand, cauldron, and broomstick at the start of the summer break and forbid him to talk to the neighbors. One of the interesting conflicts, kind of thematic contrasts that we've seen in the first 2 books is the contrast between the mundane and the fantastical, the mundane and the explicitly medieval. We've said many times while studying Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets that medievalism, antiquity, is oftentimes heralded simply by virtue of its own age and sense of tradition as virtuous. Things that are old are good within the frame of the first 2 books, and things which are modern are not. Now, we start to stress that a little in Chamber of Secrets with Arthur Weasley's obsession with Muggle technology and Muggle artifacts, but it's still not terribly developed at that point. But here we get a really interesting piece of descriptive language, I suppose. We're referencing, of course, the extract from the textbook when we say that they were muggles and they had a very medieval attitude toward magic. Now, it is a medieval attitude in the sense that they are fearful and ignorant. Those are common traits associated somewhat unfairly with the medieval period of European history. But by deliberately drawing a comparison between the Dursleys, by drawing a comparison between the Muggle world and this kind of medievalism, we are reframing our perspective on the wizarding world. The wizarding world no longer seems like an anachronistic throwback. It no longer seems like a niche incidental culture. Over the course of this book, and over the course of the next few chapters, in fact, we are going to frame the Muggle world as the small, safe, secluded, sequestered world of mundane experience. And the wizarding world is going to expand around the periphery to encompass the Muggle world. Think about how we considered Hogwarts and Diagon Alley and all of Harry's experience, in fact, in the first 2 books, particularly in the first book. Harry is pulled from the regular everyday world into his magical experience, but here we're inverting that sense of vulnerability. We're inverting that sense of the status quo, I suppose. Already in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban, we are asserting, we are shifting the reader's perspective such that it becomes clear that no, the wizarding world is the real world, and the Muggle world is the one which is protected. The Muggle world is this little sequestered theme park of whimsicality and mundanity. It's not real. It's not vibrant. And that marks one of the most important, most pivotal shifts in tone that we will get in the entire series. Harry's time at Hogwarts is no longer analogous to, traveling through a wardrobe to Narnia. It is no longer analogous to being removed from the real world into this magical realist world. Now the opposite is true. Harry is suspended outside the real world during his summer vacations with the Dursleys, and that is vital. I mean, that does everything that we need it to do, and I find it immediately compelling. Let me pick up a question here from Twitter where Kate Bennett asks, I love the switches back and forth between 3 or 4 different narrative distances, perspectives, and tones in chapter 1. Between pages 1 and 2, and again at the start of this page, the Dursley family of number 4. Yes, we're all over the place here, and that is very, very intentional. We get very close to Harry in certain moments, and then we step back again. We adopt a more narrative tone about Harry's experience and Harry's adventures. And then ultimately, at the end of tonight's reading, we are going to lose track of Harry completely. We are going to elide his experience from the pages of the book, which is, well, it's a striking choice. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Let me see here. Yes, it Don't Connect says, I just noticed that Alistair has a Marauders map behind him. I approve. I do. I have a Marauders map, and you can't see it behind my head, but I do have a copy of Prisoner of Azkaban. I have Hogwarts house glasses, and that's Harry's wand sticking out of the Gryffindor glass. Just a little, studio decoration to make us all feel in the mood here as we push forward through through Prisoner of Azkaban. Yes, good. Good. All right. Melissa says, the wizarding world has been invading Harry's life. He's even doing his homework in his muggle room. Exactly. This is unthinkable. And we're locking away the accoutrement of his wizarding experience, but he now cannot be removed from that experience. He is now more integrated than ever. And of course, we're going to see that transition too, because while he is integrated in a... I want to draw this distinction here, and I want to do it carefully because there is an unpleasant connotation around the word juvenile, and I don't want to inadvertently, cast aspersions on the story. The first 2 books in the Harry Potter series are juvenile. That is, they are of or relating to children. And that's absolutely appropriate. That is true to Harry's experience. But Prisoner of Azkaban marks the transition between the juvenile and the adolescent. Harry is starting to approach not just maturity in a physical sense, and certainly not maturity in a legal sense, but maturity in a sense of his own identity, his understanding of himself, his integration and interaction with the outside world, the entire outside world in general, in fact. This is where we are pivoting. So if I talk about the first 2 books as being juvenile and of our experience of Prisoner of Azkaban and the rest of the series as being kind of post-juvenile, adolescent, and then thereafter, I would even argue in the last book, adult, fully outright adult, that's not to, cast unnecessary aspersions on the first 2 books. Okay, let me see here. Good. We're caught up with the YouTube chat. Everything is working. Let's press on because we still have more slides to get to. And we're going to continue this idea of inversion, of shifting and almost substituting our understanding of the wizarding world and the muggle world with a brief anecdote about an experience that Harry has early in the summer holidays before his 3rd year. Harry was particularly keen to avoid trouble with his aunt and uncle at the moment, as they were already in an especially bad mood with him, all because he'd received a telephone call from a fellow wizard 1 week into the school vacation. Ron Weasley, who was one of Harry's best friends at Hogwarts, came from a whole family of wizards. This meant that he knew a lot of things Harry didn't, but he had never used a telephone before. Most unluckily, it had been Uncle Vernon who had answered the call. Vernon Dursley speaking. Harry, who happened to be in the room at the time, froze as he heard Ron's voice answer. Hello! Hello, can you hear me? I want to talk to Harry Potter. This is classic Ron, first of all, and works beautifully as a reintroduction to Ron's kind of well-intentioned but perhaps insufficiently thoughtful approach to the world. But much more importantly, it subverts our understanding of what is muggle and what is magical. The turning of the telephone, of a quintessentially muggle technology, into a vector for the intrusion of the magical world is stunning. It's breathtaking in its ambition here. Now, it isn't simply the case that Vernon and Petunia can preserve the status quo simply by ignoring the wizarding world. Now the wizarding world is coming to them. And if we contrast this with Harry's experience at the beginning of Chamber of Secrets, we'll see that the intrusion of this muggle vector, the subversion of our expectations of the mundane world, indicates a shift in the balance of power. And that is not to suggest that, well, the wizarding world has become this much more powerful in the last year, that anything really happened during the events of Chamber of Secrets that caused the muggle world to go into decline and caused the wizarding world to become ever more powerful and ever more prevalent. That's not true. That doesn't seem to be supported by anything in the text itself. Rather, this is part of this reframing. And when I say reframing, I suppose it's important to acknowledge one thing right up front. There is a narrative, there is a myth that has been constructed around J.K. Rowling and the writing of the Harry Potter series, which is that it was all planned out from the beginning, that every detail was in place, that it was meticulous, that she knew exactly what she was doing as she moved from page to page, from book to book. And I think that, honestly, an analysis of the text disproves that theory trivially, disproves that theory outright. The way that we change our understanding of the wizarding world, the way that we change our understanding of Hogwarts, of the rules of magic themselves, of the kind of bureaucratic and social infrastructure that supports the wizarding world and kind of integrates the wizarding world with the muggle world, all of these changes are clearly retcons. These are patches that are applied to the previous stories in order to facilitate the telling of new stories. And that's completely fine. The story does not have to be planned out in its entirety from the jump in order to be valuable. It doesn't make it less meaningful. It doesn't make it less profound. It doesn't make it less powerful. It doesn't make it less startling an accomplishment. The writing of this series is a literary phenomena. It is no less than that. But it is clear that J.K. Rowling didn't always understand the wizarding world as she understands it now. So with that said, and with that understood, and certainly to take nothing away from the accomplishment of this series, I find it fascinating that we are now reframing our experience, that we are introducing the reader to a new status quo, to a new power balance, a new power imbalance almost, that we are, instead of having the wizarding world being this tiny little sequestered space, now it looms and lurks in every shadow. Now it is constantly on the periphery of your vision and on the periphery of your experience. And in that way, it is perhaps more true to the very beginning of the first book than anything that we've read to date. If you remember the beginning of the first book, right after Harry is adopted by the Dursleys, is surrendered into the care of the Dursleys, a dubious choice, by the way, on the part of Dumbledore and McGonagall, but we'll let that pass for now. Right after that sequence, we get this account of Vernon Dursley moving through the world just surrounded by these hints of magic, these hints of wizards and wizardry. It's a really interesting and kind of proactively oppressive approach to Muggle life. But then we dial that all the way back because the purpose of the first two books is to give Harry this escape. But now that Harry is 13, and now crucially that the readers of the series are 2 years older than they used to be, we're now getting a more thoughtful and considered and developed approach to the interaction of these two worlds. And that is all to the good. And this, by the way, is not the end. I've described this as the first major turning point in our understanding of the wizarding world, and I think that that is true. But this is not the last turning point in our understanding of the wizarding world. We are going to get perspectives in every subsequent book, in fact, which expand our understanding, which allow us to connect more personally, more immediately, more emotionally with Harry's experience. We grow as Harry grows, and it's okay that that wasn't necessarily intended right from the beginning. It's okay that there were retcons contained in this book. I don't think that pulling out any of the miscellaneous nitpicky trivia that you can call upon, Google any of these books and you'll find lists and lists and lists of goofs and mistakes and all, I don't think that's actually valuable at all. I don't think that that's even necessarily narratively interesting. I think that it does nothing to invalidate J.K. Rowling's approach to storytelling, that she got better at storytelling. And she did demonstrably get better at storytelling. This is far and away, I think, the most advanced, sophisticated, and accomplished Harry Potter book that we've had so far. As Kimberly says here in the YouTube chat, the reframing works for me in the context of the story. Harry has now integrated into the wizard world enough that it is now the real world. Yes, very good. Very good. I like that. I'm scrolling back to see if I've missed any questions. Hermione Becky, I read this scene as a loss, because if Ron could use the phone properly, Harry would have been able to talk to his friend sort of undercover without interference from the Dursleys. It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. But we're still getting these points of implicit and fundamental conflict between the wizarding world and the Muggle world. It's fine that Ron, I mean, we can understand that Ron specifically doesn't understand how to use a telephone, but of course, that is an example of a much larger problem, which is that the Muggle world and the wizarding world speak different languages. I mean, they fundamentally speak different languages. And we're going to get the counterpoint to this in just a few pages' time when we get to the Owl Post, the event which gives us the title for our introductory chapter. So I think you're right. It is a kind of quiet tragedy, but it's not a quiet tragedy that has anything to do with Ron and Vernon Dursley per se, as much as it has to do with the interaction of the wizarding and Muggle worlds. That would be my perspective on it, at least. Okay. Yes, as Rahit says here, I don't think Vernon would let Harry use the phone anyway, is the thing. Yes. Good. Don't you come near my family is foreshadowing book 4, says Gildarts Winters. There's a lot of foreshadowing here too. Yes. Good. All right, let's move on to our next slide here and a brief recap of Harry's experience. Harry, though still rather small and skinny for his age, had grown a few inches over the last year. His jet black hair, however, was just as it had always been, stubbornly untidy whatever he did to it. The eyes behind his glasses were bright green, and on his forehead, clearly visible through his hair, was a thin scar, shaped like a bolt of lightning. Of all the unusual things about Harry, this scar was the most extraordinary of all. It was not, as the Dursleys had pretended for 10 years, a souvenir of the car crash that had killed Harry's parents, because Lily and James Potter had not died in a car crash. They had been murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years, Lord Voldemort. Harry had escaped from the same attack with nothing more than a scar on his forehead, where Voldemort's curse, instead of killing him, had rebounded upon its originator. Barely alive, Voldemort had fled, but Harry had come face to face with him at Hogwarts. Remembering their last meeting as he stood at the dark window, Harry had to admit he was lucky even to have reached his 13th birthday. I mentioned earlier that, in my opinion, J.K. Rowling is demonstrably improved in her craft within the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban. And here we see just a little of that mastery. One of the things that I'm just not going to have time to talk about over the next 12 weeks of Dear Mr. Potter Season 3 is Rowling's masterful control of pacing. And she's always been good at that. Even in the first 2 books, she can control the unfolding of events. She has an ability to expand and contract the narrative in unexpected ways, to keep you hooked, to force you forward, or to drag you back. She's always been good at that, but she has never been this good. And now she's deviating from the expected rules of grammar in order to do it. Because Lily and James Potter had not died in a car crash. They had been murdered, murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years, Lord Voldemort. That repetition of murdered, spliced with that comma, isn't strictly grammatical. And at least an editor would urge you to contract that, to rephrase that, to find a different way of saying that thing. But the effect is undeniable. The stuttering pause of the comma there. They had been murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years. And again, most feared dark wizard for 100 years, dark wizards aren't good. You guys, we're getting our reintroduction here. We're establishing the frame of Harry's experience. And then look at that ellipsis at the end of that paragraph. Barely alive, Voldemort had fled, period. Ellipsis. But Harry had come face to face with him at Hogwarts. Remembering their last meeting as he stood at the dark window, Harry had to admit he was lucky even to have reached his 13th birthday. So we get this gorgeous transition back into Harry's POV as he's standing at the window. Observe that we begin this slide. Harry, though still rather small and skinny for his age, had grown a few inches over the last year. That's not in Harry's POV. We're in the narrative POV there. This is this omniscient third-person narrator telling us this. But then we move back into Harry's experience, and we do it with an effortless segue that communicates the enormity of Harry's experience, the immediacy of Harry's experience, and the shadow that it has cast over him. As Heroes and Bards says in the YouTube chat, Harry's inner monologue is so dramatic, as it should be. He's 13. I think we all have dramatic internal monologues when we are 13. Good. Jamie says this is a really interesting point, and I think a very fair one. This is one of the reasons I love Harry Potter over other YA novels. The other YA series are fine, but the writing doesn't hold up the way JKR's does. And I think that's valid. I think that there are exceptional YA series out there. So many that it is, I mean, almost meaningless to talk about YA as a genre. YA, of course, isn't meaningfully a genre. It's a marketing term that describes the audience rather than the content of the book, but that's a discussion for another time. I think that there are magnificent YA series out there, many, many magnificent YA series out there, but there is sometimes a sniffy, snobbish kind of dismissal of Harry Potter based on the fact that it is A, genre, B, for YA audiences, or as they were called at the time, juvenile audiences, because we can't underestimate or we can't overemphasize how much J.K. Rowling created YA as a modern phenomenon. But it is crucial that these books are simply beautifully written, and increasingly beautifully written. I keep talking about Prisoner of Azkaban as my favorite book, and that doesn't suggest, you guys, that seasons 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 of Dear Mr. Potter are going to be in any way bleak or uninteresting or crucially unenthusiastic. The writing, I think, continues to improve through the series. So I'm very much looking forward to tracking her both moment to moment narrative, that is the prose on the page in front of her, her craft, as it were, and also her art, the development of her storytelling technique beyond the kind of fairly elementary plots that we get in the first 2 books. Clearly, Chamber of Secrets is a much more ambitious plot than the Philosopher's Stone. It is much more enfolded upon itself, and we can see, I think, we can see a very clear development. You know, Philosopher's Stone, pretty linear, pretty straightforward. Chamber of Secrets, much more ambitious and a little more geometrically challenging. And then into Prisoner of Azkaban, which is much more sophisticated, which relies upon, you know, interesting nested structures within its overall arc. We'll talk about those as we move through them. How have they not made a TV show set in this world, asks Becca Eller. Licensing, I can only imagine. Licensing is probably the answer. Yeah. Licensing Harry Potter is not cheap. Okay, so we've had our recap here of Harry's experience. Lily and James Potter did not die in a car crash. We get the reintroduction of Lord Voldemort, and we've established that this is a recurring conflict, that this is not a conflict that is in Harry's past. It is very much a conflict that is in his present. And when I say in his present, I don't necessarily mean imminent. Minor spoilers, I suppose. We're not really going to deal with Voldemort, excuse me, in this book. We're not really going to address that underlying conflict. We're going to be, his shadow is going to be evident, of course. His influence is going to be felt, but that's not the story of this book. But we're reintroduced to Harry in that shadow. We're reintroduced to Harry under that influence. And that's of vital importance because Harry is integrating these experiences. He is the product of the first 2 years at Hogwarts, and of course the 10 years before that, but crucially those first 2 years at Hogwarts. And we're going to see his relationship with Hogwarts as an institution change, his relationship with Ron and Hermione change, his relationship with the wizarding world as a general concept change, because he is growing up. That's, God, it's all so good. All right, let's move into our letters. I have pulled all 4 of the letters that Harry receives. It is possibly worth spending a moment on his gifts. I like how emblematic the gifts are of his friends. And again, we might be reminded at this point that there are 4 Hogwarts houses, as I'm sure all of you know. But really, there are 3 Hogwarts houses, plus protagonist house, Gryffindor. I've said before that the actual dynamic between Harry and Ron and Hermione is the kind of tripartite character dynamic of ethos, logos, and pathos. Harry is ethos. He is heroic. He is protagonistic. He unifies the two disparate sides of his character, embodied here by the logos of Hermione, that is the strict rationalistic approach of Hermione, and the pathos of Ron, that is the emotional and somewhat undependable, core, the heart of Ron Weasley. He unifies these things into action. That is what makes the ethos role special. It is all about agency. But of course, those three things are embodied within Hogwarts without the inclusion of Gryffindor. Hermione is Ravenclaw, and Ron is Hufflepuff, and Harry is Slytherin, and that would be true if not for the fact that they're our heroes. They are our good guys. That is why they are Gryffindor. And of course, again here, as I talk about J.K. Rowling retconning things in her books, details in her books, change her mind about the houses, and she's going to change her mind about how the houses work. But as houses were introduced to us back in the first book and then developed into the second book, this is absolutely true. You'll remember, if you studied Chamber of Secrets with me, that we had our Hufflepuff trio. We had our power trio of Hufflepuff kids kind of moving through the story alongside Ron and Hermione and Harry. So we see this tripartite structure everywhere within the world of Harry Potter, far beyond even just Hogwarts, but everywhere within the world of Harry Potter. We're going to continue to track that. But the reason that I bring this up is that we see Ron's Hufflepuff nature embodied, kind of made representative by his, or represented in his gift to Harry for his birthday. And we see Hermione's Ravenclaw nature embodied in her gift too. So Ron gives the pocket sneakoscope, which is of course all about trust and all about loyalty. Hufflepuff virtues right there. Hermione gives the broomstick servicing kit, which is all about, care and attention to detail and prevention. Ravenclaw traits right there. And we get the Monster Book of Monsters from Hagrid. Pretty great gifts, pretty emblematic, pretty representative of underlying characters there. Merging Puppy here in the YouTube chat says, not only are the gifts emblematic of the characters who gave them, as I was reading, I noticed that the notes and gifts track each other's characters' respective arcs through the story. That's ambitious. Okay, let's put this to the test. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at our letters here, and we're going to begin with Ron. And I urge you, as we look at these letters, to pay attention to the content, of course, but also to pay attention to the way that they are written, because we get powerful introductions into our characters here. This is really strong writing. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Look, I'm really sorry about the telephone call. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dan, and he reckons I shouldn't have shouted. It's amazing here in Egypt. Bill's taking us around the tombs, and you wouldn't believe the curses these old Egyptian wizards put on them. Mum wouldn't let Ginny come in the last one. There were all these mutant skeletons in there of Muggles who'd broken in and grown extra heads and stuff. I couldn't believe it when Dad won the Daily Profit draw. 700 galleons. Most of it's gone on this trip, but they're going to buy me a new wand for next year. Harry remembered only too well the occasion when Ron's old wand had snapped. It had happened when the car the two of them had been flying to Hogwarts had crashed into a tree on the school grounds. We'll be back about a week before term starts. We'll be going up to London to get my wand and our new books. Any chance of meeting you there? Don't let the Muggles get you down. Try and come to London. Ron. P.S. Percy's head boy. He got the letter last week. What do we see? What do we learn about Ron Weasley from this letter? Well, his enthusiasm, his genuine affection, his fascination with detail, but also his inability to really keep track of a coherent through line. Ron is a conversational shotgun. Here's everything in my experience, Harry. You're getting it all, and you're getting it right now, and you're getting it with exclamation points. And I hope that's okay. And come to London. It's going to be great. Don't let the Muggles get you down. This is classic Ron. This tells us everything that we need to know about who he is. And he opens with, happy birthday. Firstly, a personal, direct note. Dear Harry, happy birthday! Exclamation point. That's the most important thing. Look, I'm really sorry about that telephone call. We get the conversational style of Ron's dialogue, even in his letter writing. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dan, and he reckons I shouldn't have shouted. So, conceding the point. He's outright apologizing. I mean, without, going into it too much, and certainly we don't presume that Ron carries a great burden of guilt, but here he is nonetheless. I'm sorry about that phone call. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dad and he reckons I shouldn't have shouted. Boom, boom, boom. One thought, two thought, three thought, we're done. Then, it's amazing here in Egypt. Bill's taking us around all the tombs and you wouldn't believe the curses these old Egyptian wizards put on them. We're getting, again, this rapid fire succession of incidental detail. It's all delivered with enthusiasm and it's all delivered in this lovely intimacy, which I adore, but it's not focused, it's not constructed, and it's not careful. As Dry Heaving Llamas says here in the YouTube chat, Ron is a stream of consciousness character, so it makes sense that he's a stream of consciousness writer. I like that very much. I think that's absolutely true. Are we getting I see that we're getting some video issues. I do apologize. I'm just I don't know, I'm showing a slide, so I can't imagine that we're getting terribly bad video issues. I hope that you guys can refresh. Everything here looks good to me. I'm terribly sorry. Hopefully it will all work out, and if not, the podcast version will be okay. Sorry, you guys. Some things are beyond my control, even as a gifted technomancer. Yes. If you are having video issues, just hit, Control R, hit F5, and try and refresh and come back. Sometimes YouTube just gets a little choked up when we start talking about Ron Weasley. We'll note the deviation here in Ron's letter, too. We get all of this enthusiasm. We get all of this punctuation. We'll be back about a week before term starts. We'll be going up to London to get my wand and our new books. Any chance of meeting you there? Don't let the Muggles get you down. Try and come to London. Ron. P.S. Percy's head boy. He got the letter last week. There's no detail there. There's no personal detail. Ron is not giving us a personal account of his experience. This is simply a informational transaction. It's a sharp shift in the tone. So we are primed, I think, to expect something about Percy being head boy even before we get to Hermione's letter, which is just gorgeous. Yeah. Let's move on to Hermione's letter. Although I guess before we do that, let's note the continuity here. The Weasleys have gone to Egypt. The Weasleys have gone to Egypt to be with Bill. They won the draw in the Daily Prophet, 700 galleons. That's a significant sum of money, and the Weasleys have all gone on holiday, which is presumably why Harry has not spent the summer with them at the Burrow, or is at least the explanation why Ron hasn't slipped away in some magical conveyance and come to visit Harry in person. They've been in Egypt the whole summer. They're only getting back the week before term starts. Okay, let's move on to Hermione's letter and note how different this is. Dear Harry, Ron wrote to me and told me about his phone call to your Uncle Vernon. I do hope you're all right. I'm on holiday in France at the moment, and I didn't know how I was going to send this to you. What if they'd opened it at customs? But then Hedwig turned up. I think she wanted to make sure you got something for your birthday for a change. I bought your present by owl order. There was an advertisement in the Daily Prophet. I've been getting it delivered. It's so good to keep up with what's going on in the wizarding world. Did you see that picture of Ron and his family a week ago? I bet he's learning loads. I'm really jealous. The ancient Egyptian wizards were fascinating. There's some interesting local history of witchcraft here, too. I've rewritten my whole history of magic essay to include some of the things I've found out. I hope it's not too long. It's 2 rolls of parchment, more than Professor Binns asked for. Ron says he's going to be in London for the last week of the holidays. Can you make it? Will your aunt and uncle let you come? I really hope you can. If not, I'll see you on the Hogwarts Express on September 1st. Love from Hermione. P.S. Ron says Percy's head boy. I'll bet Percy's really pleased. Ron doesn't seem too happy about it. So when we get this flood of personal detail, this shotgun of personal detail from Ron, instead we get a very constructed and balanced letter from Hermione. She is careful, she is attentive, and she is analytical. She is not, crucially, emotionally disconnected. Ron wrote to me and told me about his phone call to your Uncle Vernon. I do hope you're all right. So we get a legitimate kind of emotional connection, and we get also, crucially, love from Hermione, which is pretty much unprecedented at this point in the series. This is a much more adult kind of interaction, at least to my reading, that feels intentional in an interesting way. But what we get is a constructed perspective on Hermione's experience. It is still personal, it is still intimate, but it is analytical in a way that Ron's isn't. Ron's is, oh my God, 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 oh my God. And Hermione's is, well, this is interesting, and here's why. Also, I love Hermione's use of punctuation. There's a semicolon in there. There are parentheses in there. She's very good. This is absolutely classic Hermione. Good. Dylan the Joel says in the YouTube chat, this is the first of multiple times Hermione subscribes to the DP. I can only assume she's as flaky about reading news as I am. I think you're right. I think she drops out again, doesn't she? Yes. Good. As Nicole says, Ron was just like, yeah, there were some double-headed mummies and stuff. NBD, pretty lame. But Hermione, no. She's learning loads. And not only is she learning loads, she's presuming that Ron is learning loads too. She's not quite capable of understanding Ron Weasley yet. We'll get there. Yes. All right. Duncan X says, according to Alistair, Ron is a middle school girl only in terms of enthusiasm, and I do not think that we should, hold enthusiasm as the preserve of a single gender or even a single age group. I think that enthusiasm is a valuable virtue, and Ron is to be celebrated for it. Yeah. Good. And as Rahit says here, one of the things I love about these letters throughout the series is that there are always indications that Ron and Hermione are also corresponding, which is of crucial importance, right? Because Ron and Hermione don't have this interregnum in their relationship. They don't have this this rhythm to their relationship the way that Harry does. He's the one who's removed from his context, but this isn't true of all witches and wizards. This is true of, well, basically just Harry, it would seem. He is suspended and removed. He is, well, okay, let's get right to it, because this is going to be one of our major themes moving through the book as a whole. When I talk about the inversion between the wizarding world and the muggle world, this is not just indicative of a change in tone, and it is not just about opening up the canvas that J.K. Rowling has available so that she can tell larger and more ambitious stories. It serves a specific thematic purpose within the heart of this book, because Harry is being sequestered away from the both wilder and wider wizarding world. He is being pulled away from the actual breadth of his experience and imprisoned. There is a direct analog between the eponymous Prisoner of Azkaban and Harry's experience with the Dursleys. And that is in some ways made explicit in the text, but not as fully as it might be. That's not as developed or as important, as simply and as brutally important as it potentially could be. And yet a careful reading, I think, yields that connection and draws these comparisons very directly. So for me, Harry's imprisonment here and his sequestration away from Ron and Hermione and from all the other Gryffindor kids and from the wizarding world as a whole, his thin thread of hope and connection through his textbooks, through his homework, these things are crucial. It is no coincidence that the aforementioned Prisoner of Azkaban, and I should say probably now that we're 50 minutes into our first session here, I'm not going to be jumping ahead. I'm not too terribly worried about spoilers because I'm pretty sure that everyone here in the YouTube chat has already read this book. But I feel as though if we talk about spoilers freely, if we jump ahead to the conclusion of the thing, then we miss the journey. I want to kind of de-emphasize the destination until we get there. When we get to the destination, we will talk about the destination, believe you me. But I want to talk about the journey as it is happening to us. But the aforementioned Prisoner of Azkaban and Harry share a very similar experience, both in terms of their incarceration and in terms of their liberation. When we get to the story of the escape from Azkaban, we will talk about Harry's liberation from the Dursleys, his sudden violent expulsion from this quiet and somewhat flimsy mundane world at the end of chapter 2. Gosh, at the end of chapter 2. We're not even at the end of chapter 1 yet. Let's keep going. So that is Hermione's letter. Oh, and we should note, as I called out there, the little postscript there, we get now another additional piece of information. Percy's been made head boy. I bet he's really happy about it. Ron's probably not. Hermione does understand some things about Ron, even if she doesn't understand that he's probably not learning that much in Egypt. Then we get our third letter from Hagrid. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Think you might find this useful for next year. Won't say no more here. Tell you when I see you. Hope the muggles are treating you right. All the best. Hagrid. We get focus, we get power, we get punch, we get a kind of emotional truth and presence, but it's an emotional truth or presence that is not articulated, is only implicit. Happy birthday, exclamation point, just like Ron. And remember, Hagrid is the Ron of his power trio. We saw this, I think, most powerfully in the first book, but it's certainly present in the second book too. Harry is to Dumbledore as Ron is to Hagrid as Hermione is to Minerva McGonagall. We see that same triplicate structure replicated throughout the book. As I said, we also get a triplicate structure just embedded in House Hufflepuff, and we're going to see at least one more triplicate structure in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban. So there's no surprise here that Hagrid's letter is very similar to Ron's letter. Happy birthday! Exclamation point. Think you might find this useful for next year. Won't say no more here. Tell you when I see you. Hope the Muggles are treating you right. All the best, Hagrid. That's the direct connection. Hagrid, says Dylan the Joel, is the Hemingway of all his groups. I like that very much. Yes, good. Sean says, Hagrid wrestles with Dumbledore for my favorite character in Harry Potter. Yeah, I think we all love Hagrid. There's a lot of love for Hagrid here. There's a lot of love for Hagrid here in the YouTube chat. Good. All right, let's keep pushing on to Minerva McGonagall. And again, we'll see the echo here of Hermione, though we should note that this is probably not a personal letter. This is the letter which accompanies the form. Now, it is addressed to Harry, but this is suggestive to me simply of some kind of wizarding mail merge that has happened here. Dear Mr. Excuse me, I've got to get my Minerva McGonagall voice back in. I haven't done this in a year now. This is terrible. Dear Mr. Potter, please note that the new school year will begin on September the 1st. The Hogwarts Express will leave from King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock. Third years are permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade on certain weekends. Please give the enclosed permission form to your parent or guardian to sign. A list of books for next year is enclosed. Yours sincerely, Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Just like Hermione's letter, we get this clipped, informative, not cold, not austere, not outright rationalistic, but informative, primarily informative. This is the reflection of Hermione here. And seeing these four letters, these four examples of intimate character voice in such close proximity confirms to me outright that these connections are intentional, that we are supposed to see Ron and Hagrid as being birds of a feather, and we are, well, I guess birds of a feather would be more appropriate for Hermione and McGonagall, right? But we were supposed to see these paired characters as being connected, and these being representative in a broader sense of virtue. Virtue is going to be one of our major themes of this book. We are going to spend a lot of time thinking about what it is that makes a person good, what it is that makes a person good in the eyes of others, what it is that makes a person good in the eyes of the law, what justice is, because I drew the connection earlier between the Prisoner of Azkaban and Harry, but they are not the only people who are going to, or the only beings, the only creatures who are going to come into conflict with a kind of indifferent and abstract bureaucratic legal system. We're going to talk about Buckbeak is what I'm saying. Yes, this is a good catch here on Twitter from Outlander Pam, who says the letters themselves are in italics. It's the internal monologue or thoughts from the narrator that are in regular thought. That's very good. Yes, we're getting these. Italics is a convention for internal thought, certainly. Also a convention for extended quotation to offset it from the body text with more than just a line break. Line breaks are unreliable for readers. You don't really want to necessarily just offset different perspectives or different narrative voices in line breaks, because sometimes readers will skip over that and be confused. So we traditionally offset them in italics, but it is no coincidence that these letters are offset in italics, which are also used for inner monologue. When Harry has thoughts all his own, when he's actually articulating, articulating thoughts internally, we'll get those offset in italics too. Good. Okay. Aaron asks, what Patreon level do we need for underground audiobooks read by Alistair? More money than any of us have, I'm sure. The very litigious estate of J.K. Rowling is probably not going to be cool with that, you guys. Maybe I'll just write some knockoff fan fiction and I can read that pretty legally, I guess, as long as I don't sell it. So that is the end of the first chapter, Owl Post. Clearly, this is the bulk of the chapter is reconnecting Harry with his world and introducing that world to us. And we conclude with the rather touching thought that Harry is enjoying his birthday. It is now 2 a.m. by the time he's done opening his mail. He has his gifts. He looks up at his 3 little cards on the mantle and feels warmed by this. Even though he is imprisoned, he is sustained by thoughts beyond his cell. He is sustained by the world and the continued existence of the world beyond his cell. Again, make a note of that, because that's going to be important later. We then begin chapter 2. And before we begin chapter 2, actually, I kind of want to talk about I want to talk about the chapter, the title of chapter 2, and possibly also a point of clarification. I have had some odd questions here. There are a couple of points in which British English is not translated sufficiently for an American audience. It is noted that Aunt Marge is blown up by Harry at the end of this chapter. That does not mean that she is exploded. That does not mean that she dies. As we'll get in chapter 3, she is actually returned to her regular state and her memories are erased and everything is just fine. Harry does not kill Aunt Marge, though he might conceivably. We're going to talk a little about the role of magic and the function of magic. The way that magic works in this chapter is unlike any example of magic that we've seen in Harry Potter to date, and honestly, mostly unlike examples of magic in Harry Potter that we will see after this event either. It's a little odd. We'll talk about it as we get to it. But we begin with Vernon Dursley watching the news. Harry sat down between Dudley and Uncle Vernon, a large, beefy man with very little neck and a lot of moustache. Far from wishing Harry a happy birthday, none of the Dursleys made any sign that they had noticed Harry enter the room, but Harry was far too used to this to care. He helped himself to a piece of toast and then looked up at the reporter on the television, who was halfway through a report on an escaped convict. The public is warned that Black is armed and extremely dangerous. A special hotline has been set up, and any sighting of Black should be reported immediately. No need to tell us, he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring over the top of his newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, the filthy layabout. Look at his hair. He shot a nasty look sideways at Harry, whose untidy hair had always been a source of great annoyance to Uncle Vernon. Compared to the man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by a matted, elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. Foreshadowing is happening right now. But much more importantly than just foreshadowing, we're getting the hints of some deeper connection here. We're getting hints of not just a simple foreshadowing in the sense that we are introducing now an element that will be significant later, but we are introducing now an element which is already significant, though you don't know it. The personal connection between Harry and Sirius Black cannot be overlooked. The direct kind of physical comparison. He shot talking about Vernon, he shot a nasty look sideways at Harry, whose untidy hair had always been a source of great annoyance to Uncle Vernon. Compared to the man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by a matted elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. That direct comparison is crucial. And there is here, well, there is here a possible interpretation. As Jenna calls out here in all caps in the YouTube chat, hooray, let's align Harry and the mass murderer right away. Yes, I mean, fair. I want to look very closely at Uncle Vernon's dialogue here. No need to tell us he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring over the top of his newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, the filthy layabout. Look at his hair. No need to tell us that he's no good. We're not just drawing a personal connection between Harry and Black. We're drawing a personal connection between the Dursleys and Black. Now, this may be interpreted as, a simple piece of snobbery, but the grammatical ambiguity there, consider this. Does Vernon Dursley know Sirius Black? Is that possible? Does he recognize Sirius Black? Well, it seems as though he doesn't. We're probably going to be pretty clear on the fact that he doesn't in due course, but no need to tell us he's no good. That italicization of he suggests a personal connection. We're talking specifically, yes, as Kate says here on Twitter, lunatic could be coming up the street right now. Yeah, he could, Vernon. Little foreshadowing there too. Yes. Heroes and Bard says, you would have thought that they would have met or Lily would have mentioned his name at some point. Yes, although, a lot of time has passed, and it certainly is the case that Vernon Dursley doesn't voluntarily engage with the wizarding world. But nonetheless, whether or not Vernon or Petunia know about Sirius Black, the grammatical ambiguity allows us to perceive a connection there that is going to be evident later, that is going to be manifest later. Yeah. And of course, you'll remember that we talked about the connections between kind of not Vernon, but Petunia and the wizarding world back when we talked about Chamber of Secrets, because it is made very clear in the text that Petunia knows about Hogwarts. She understands the wizarding world. She is aware of it and yet downplays that knowledge. So what Petunia knew and when would actually be a fascinating topic for a very careful thematic and textual interpretation of the Harry Potter series. So I got distracted earlier, didn't I? I was going to talk about the title of Chapter 2, because the title of Chapter 2 is Aunt Marge's Big Mistake. And the reason that I find that interesting is that it puts responsibility for what happens on Aunt Marge, that she is not just a victim of this, but fundamentally to blame for this. And again, when we're drawing comparisons between Harry and Black, when we're drawing comparisons between the victims and the prisoners, I suppose we can kind of draw that as broadly as possible. I'm kind of scanning through the book mentally here and kind of tracking that comparison. But yes, when we are looking at the difference between criminals and those who break the laws, those who break the rules, and the people who are the victims of that behavior. I don't want to stress victims too much here. We're going to see a certain continuity, a certain consistency of approach, and certainly a consistency of virtue. We're going to align in some ways Harry and Sirius Black and Buckbeak, and there are a couple of other examples that we'll get to, minor examples in due course. But putting responsibility for these events on Aunt Marge kind of shifts our focus again on Harry. He's going to do something here which is pretty indefensible, but is also outright defensible, because we're shifting our moral framework. You'll remember back in our discussion of the first two books, the emphasis that was put on the kind of absolute authoritarian structure of the boarding school adventure. That is to say that the rules at Hogwarts are the rules at Hogwarts, because within the frame of the juvenile boarding school adventure, that authority is absolute. Teachers are not to be questioned unless they are clearly not to be trusted, like, Snape, for example, or are at least morally dubious internally, like Snape. We're kind of leaving that behind now. It is very difficult to imagine the Harry of the first two books taking this action in this way and being narratively justified in this action. Now, of course, we can look at this and say, yeah, she deserved this and so much worse. Good Lord, she deserved this and so much worse. She's vile. And it takes some skill, let me tell you, to create a character and introduce a character who makes Vernon Dursley look positively affable, positively, and I mean literally avuncular. She's the worst, and she deserves everything that happens to her, but still, we're aligned with Harry in a way that I feel we would not have been aligned with Harry in the previous books. Another example of this pivot toward a more mature outlook here. Well, and Becca raises an interesting question. Did Harry do this deliberately? If it was an accident, it's really not his fault. We'll talk about that as we get to it. Yes, because it's not at all clear. I mentioned earlier that we step back from Harry's POV. We'll discuss it as we get to it. Yeah. As Jenna says, this is one of the things that drives me nuts. How does magic work in this world? Well, it's magical. It's magical. J.K. Rowling, for all of the structure of Hogwarts, leaves space for genuinely unpredictable magic that stands in contrast to our understanding. Magic is not, well, okay, magic sometimes is just an alternate form of science. If you think about Snape's potions class, for example, if you even think about, minor charms and spells, they do seem to be completely rigorous and completely consistent. They seem to be scientific in their consistency and in their application. But just beyond that, there is a broader magic. There is a darker magic. There is a graver magic, and a more ambiguous, a more elusive magic. And that, again, is something that we'll investigate further as we move through Prisoner of Azkaban. Yeah. Doesn't Harry refer to it as accidental magic? Well, certainly Cornelius Fudge refers to it as accidental magic, but that's capital A, capital M. So it's not clear exactly how euphemistic that title is. Certainly Harry doesn't get in trouble, so it doesn't seem as though it's conscious. Harry doesn't cast a spell. We don't get any outright spell casting from Harry, but the exact mechanics of magic, still a little loose. Yeah. She's the worst, says Jamie, until we meet Umbridge. You're right. We're going to supersede even Aunt Madge, and we're going to do it. Oh boy, I can't yet talk about Dolores Umbridge. I'm not prepared, you guys. I'm not ready for that. Good. All right. I wanted to go back to, I think, Becca, it was you who asked about the word beefy in the description of Uncle Vernon. And this is another one of these moments where there's a slight transatlantic gap here. Beefy can be used in the United States to mean someone who is kind of, solidly built but muscular. It has a kind of, stalwart, salt of the earth, kind of blue collar kind of feel to it. It is never used in that sense in the United Kingdom. In the UK, beefy is just a euphemism for fat. That is it. So we're certainly not suggesting that Uncle Vernon is in any way kind of, beefy in that kind of, I don't know what the direct translation would be. Just kind of heavy and solidly built and rugged. That's not what we're saying about Uncle Vernon. No, he's just portly. He is obese. He is a full-figured man. Yes. Good. Am I saying Madge? No, Marge. This is my pronunciation, and I don't know if you can tell either, but I have like a slight head thing going on right now, so I'm not hitting my consonants quite as clearly as I should. Yes. Pudgy is very good. Yes. Pudgy is exactly the word. Maybe even more so than pudgy. Yes. Excellent. All right. Let's keep moving on, because we have to get to the introduction of the rules as I share the slide with you. Or not the rules. I had already moved on to the rules. I'm terribly sorry. I've got to get back here. Yes. Firstly, growled Uncle Vernon, you keep a civil tongue in your head when you're talking to Marge. All right, said Harry bitterly, if she does when she's talking to me. Secondly, said Uncle Vernon, acting as though he had not heard Harry's reply, as Marge doesn't know anything about your abnormality, I don't want any funny stuff when she's here. You'll behave yourself. Got me? I will, if she does, said Harry through gritted teeth. And thirdly, said Uncle Vernon, his mean little eyes now slits in his great purple face. Excuse me. We've told Marge you attend St. Brutus's Secure Center for Incurably Criminal Boys. What? Harry yelled. And you'll be sticking to that story, boy, or there'll be trouble, spat Uncle Vernon. Here are the rules. First, a civil tongue. Second, no abnormality, no funny stuff while she's here. Third, preserve the fiction. This is the lie that we have told, and you are going to be complicit in it. All of which is to say that there is one rule for Aunt Marge: preserve the status quo. Preserve the facade. We will be, to all outside observation, completely normal. We will be number 4 Privet Drive, and you will play your part in that, or there will be trouble. The domination here of Harry's will and the kind of brutal demand that is placed upon him works beautifully in complement with the permission slip for Hogsmeade. Harry has a reason to play along with this, so he has to be driven to outrageous action, driven to excessive action by the events that we'll see over the course of the next few pages. Yes, his cover story, he's a criminal, says Melissa. Right, another connection back, right? And not just a criminal, but an incurably criminal boy. Yes, good. All right, so let's move on to to the exploding wine glass. You mustn't blame yourself for the way the boys turned out, Vernon, she said over lunch on the third day. If there's something rotten on the inside, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Harry tried to concentrate on his food, and his hands shook, and his face was starting to burn with anger. Remember the form, he told himself. Think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything. Don't rise. Aunt Marge reached for her glass of wine. It's one of the basic rules of breeding, she said. You see it all the time with dogs. If there's something wrong with the bitch, there'll be something wrong with the pup. At that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. Shards of glass flew in every direction, and Aunt Marge sputtered and blinked, her great ruddy face dripping. Marge! Squeaked Aunt Petunia.
Marge, are you all right?
So this is the first instance where we step right back from Harry's POV. We're so close to him in one beat, and then so distant that he disappears from the narrative entirely in the next. Harry tried to concentrate on his food, but his hands shook and his face was starting to burn with anger. That personal account, that intimate account, his hands shook, his face is starting to burn with anger. We get that sense of Harry's emotional state there very powerfully. And then we get his internal monologue. We are as close as we can possibly be. Remember the forum, he told himself. Think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything. Don't rise. Then we get this awful point of comparison. If there's something wrong with the bitch, there's something wrong with the pup. And then, at that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. Shards of glass flew in every direction, and Aunt Marge sputtered and blinked, her great ruddy face dripping. Note how dispassionate this is. Note how strictly informative this is. We don't even get terribly emotional or emotive language. At that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. This is completely straightforward, and Harry is nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, we are so far outside of his POV that he's gone. As Hannah says in the YouTube chat, the wine glass explodes as if it happened all on its own. No sign of ownership from Harry. And Zygmorphix says, is bitch more okay in England? Okay, slightly. And also, bitch was slightly more acceptable 15 years ago when Prisoner of Azkaban was released. I don't think that we had quite reached the point as a culture that it is, let me keep my tenses straight here. We had not yet quite reached the point in culture that we have reached now, where that kind of specifically gendered and specifically unpleasant language is more frowned upon, more appropriately frowned upon. So it's partly a product of this being an English book, and partly a product of it being set 15 years ago, and partly a product of the fact that that Aunt Marge is, you know, a hideous woman, just an awful, awful person. And we have the excuse that she is talking about dogs, so we can kind of let it slide a little bit. We can get it past, you know, the juvenile audience a little bit more. It's, wow. It's, as Aaron says, she is using the term bitch correctly. Yes, kind of. But she's also clearly and directly using it to refer to Lily, which is kind of shocking, honestly. It's kind of shocking, and it's all the more shocking in the movie. You know, I find that beat in the movie actually kind of difficult. It is an abrasive moment, even from an abrasive character. Yeah. Yes, as Rahit says, to be fair, she's saying bitch to refer to the female dog, right? I mean, yes, but also it is an outright, you know, insult to Harry's mother. Drawing that direct comparison, I guess she's, well, yes, and as Jamie says, wait, aren't we reclaiming the word bitch, like boss bitch? Reclaiming the word bitch is something that can be done by people who have traditionally been the target of the word bitch. I do not get to reclaim the word bitch, for example. So it is an empowering kind of reclamation, but it is still, you can have that kind of empowering reclamation because the kind of pendulum of social opinion has swung far enough that I think that the word bitch would now not be included in this book. If this book were being published today, I think an editor would have a stern word about it, at least. Yes. Yes, good. Okay. Yes, as Jenna says right here. Sorry, but who helped him live? Sorry, I gave myself feelings. Yes, that happens from time to time as we're reading. So yes, note this powerful step back in the frame. And this is another moment where we are separated from Harry's experience. Contrast this with, you know, the kind of the counterpoint event in Chamber of Secrets is Dobby smashing the dessert, you know, is this moment of outright wizardry in a suburban setting, in a mundane setting that leads to a flashpoint of confrontation between Harry and the Dursleys. In that moment, we are 100% in Harry's POV. In this moment, we are 0% in Harry's POV. But enough is enough. No, Vernon, hiccuped Aunt Marge, holding up a hand, her tiny bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry. Go on, boy, go on. Proud of your parents, are you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash. Drunk, I expect. They didn't die in a car crash, said Harry, who found himself on his feet. They died in a car crash, you nasty little liar, and left you to be a burden on their decent, hard-working relatives, screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury. You're an insolent, ungrateful little... But Aunt Marge suddenly stopped speaking. For a moment, it looked as though words had failed her. She seemed to be swelling with inexpressible anger, but the swelling didn't stop. Her great red face started to expand. Her tiny eyes bulged, and her mouth stretched too tightly for speech. Next second, several buttons had just burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband, each of her fingers blowing up like a salami. "Marge!" yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia together as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off her chair toward the ceiling. She was entirely round now, like a vast lifebuoy, with piggy eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making apoplectic popping noises. Ripper came skidding into the room, barking madly. This is the point that we cannot accept. This is the point past which, yes, Sabrina's calling out. I was just about to get to this too. Yes, apoplectic popping noises is a lovely phrase that is actually perhaps better on the page than said out loud. So here again, we get the complete cessation of Harry's experience. "They didn't die in a car crash," said Harry, who found himself on his feet. And that "found himself" is crucial because we are kind of rendering his agency in the passive voice here. He finds himself on his feet. This is something that is happening to him rather than something that he is doing himself. And then screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury. And of course, swelling is direct foreshadowing. "You're an insolent, ungrateful little..." But Aunt Marge suddenly stopped speaking. She's already swelling before she has that final line. Harry is already taking action as soon as he disappears from the narrative. And disappear he does. And as unpleasant as all of this is, we must admire Rowling's mastery. I mean, mastery here. "Go on, boy, go on. Proud of your parents, are you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash, drunk, I expect." The repetition of "go on" there. "Go on, boy, go on." Goading Harry, deliberately, purposefully, antagonistically goading him. "Proud of your parents, are you? They go and get themselves killed in a car crash, parenthetically, drunk, I expect." The use of parentheses there indicating the aside. We don't have to attribute this dialogue, and we don't attribute this dialogue because it would break the flow. It would break the pace. The conventional way of doing this would be, "They go and get themselves killed in a car crash, drunk, I expect," Aunt Marge said to Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. You know, we would attribute that with the action to indicate that this is an aside, but instead we break kind of the convention here by including this parenthetically. "They didn't die in a car crash," said Harry, who found himself on his feet, coming in hard on that where we're breaking into Aunt Marge's dialogue there. "They died in a car crash, you nasty little liar, and left you to be a burden on their decent, hardworking relatives. You're an insolent, ungrateful little Again, we're getting that break. We're getting this immediate suspension of dialogue and then immediate suspension of action. "She seemed to be swelling with an inexpressible anger, but the swelling didn't stop, period. Her great red face started to expand, her tiny eyes bulged, her mouth stretched too tightly for speech." Then another another cessation. Next second, several buttons had just burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. Another dash. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband, each of her fingers blowing up like salami. Another dash into new dialogue. "Marge!" yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia together as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off her chair toward the ceiling. And look how we slow down toward the end there. "Marge!" yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. We get the interruption of the action with this punctuative exclamation. "Marge!" Then they yell it together as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off the chair toward the ceiling. She was entirely round, now, like a vast lifebuoy with piggy eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up in the air, making apoplectic popping noises. Look how we slow down, how we get almost graceful in our prose here as she drifts upward. Now the anger is gone. Now, yes, Gildarts is calling me out inadvertently, Uncle Virgin. Yes, I'm sorry that I put that in everyone's head. I'm terribly sorry. I mean, we don't know for sure, I guess, Dudley's parentage. Well, actually, no, Dudley's parentage of all people is completely beyond doubt, but that's a topic for another time. Or better yet, a topic for never. But look how that prose is completely controlled. It is masterful. We get jagged intercession, jagged intercutting with those dashes there in the large paragraph in the middle of the slide. And then she was entirely round now, like a vast lifebuoy with piggy eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making apoplectic popping noises. The way that we slow down here, longer words, longer clauses, longer sentences, but still using masterfully the punctuation to indicate the passage of time. She was entirely round, comma, now, comma. It's beautiful. And thank you. It just now occurs to me that I'm pronouncing this in the British tradition, life boy rather than life buoy. Yeah. So thank you for your tolerance and patience here, not calling me out in the YouTube chat. I hope that none of you called me out in the YouTube chat. If you did, I didn't see it because there are so many of you right there. Let's keep going. We've got, I guess, a little under 10 minutes and one more slide, because now that this has happened, and again, we've been so removed from Harry's experience, we're going to see the inevitable consequence. This is from the very end of the chapter. "Come back in here," he bellowed. "Come back and put her right." But a reckless rage had come over Harry. He kicked his trunk open, pulled out his wand and pointed it at Uncle Vernon. "She deserved it," Harry said, breathing very fast. "She deserved what she got. You keep away from me." He fumbled behind him for the latch on the door. "I'm going," Harry said. "I've had enough." And in the next moment, he was out in the dark, quiet street, heaving his heavy trunk behind him, Hedwig's cage under his arm. I mentioned earlier the absolute authority of authority figures in boarding school adventure stories, in many examples, many flavors and genres of juvenile fiction. Because generally speaking, when we are telling juvenile stories, we want to confirm and affirm the kind of social structures that keep the world spinning on its axis. We want to confirm the status quo. Figures of authority are figures of authority for a good reason. And if they aren't, then they are generally diabolical and villainous, and justice will be restored by the partial intercession of another figure of authority. Snape is a dubious figure at this point in the Harry Potter narrative, but that's okay, because for every Snape, there is a Dumbledore. That's going to be a wildly problematic sentence when we get later in the series, but that's fine. For every figure of flawed authority, there is a figure of just authority. For every Vernon Dursley, there is a Hagrid, kind of. For every Vernon Dursley, there is a Minerva McGonagall, at least, to choose a slightly less complicated example. We affirm the social structures that govern the lives of children, of our juvenile audience. And we've done that throughout the first two books. Harry doesn't get to say at any point, "Actually, Uncle Vernon, screw you. Actually, I'm staying at Hogwarts. Actually, this is not my life. Actually, I'm going to go and live with the Weasleys in the Burrow." He doesn't get to, because there are some authorities which in the life of a child are absolute, but no longer. Harry has broken that structure right now. And that breaking is inevitable. That happens to us all. There comes that point in our adolescent experience where we realize, actually, this is just convention. This is just unspoken agreement. This is the social contract. There's nothing stopping me from walking out that door right now. There is nothing stopping me from taking a stand, from saying what it is that I want to say, because there is no punishment that can be laid upon me that is worse than this. So Harry takes action. He levels his wand at Uncle Vernon. This is a direct threat. It may be a groundless threat. It may be a bluff. It may be hollow, but it is still, for Vernon Dursley, a direct threat of imminent violence, unspeakable magical violence. It's a really powerful and shocking moment. We see Harry transgress, but we are not privy to the mechanic of that transgression. We're going to get some insight on this next chapter, next week's reading. But by that point, we're going to be past the moment of transgression itself. Cornelius Fudge is going to kind of soothe Harry to a certain extent and kind of draw him back into the broader wizarding world. He's going to almost kind of validate Harry's nascent adolescence at this point, but that moment of transgression will still stand. And that moment of transgression will stand whether we're thinking about Harry Potter as a boarding school adventure story, which, by the way, it isn't going to be so much anymore in the future. This is actually a clear mark of a change in our tone. Or if we're thinking about the connections between Harry and Black going forward. These are important and adult moments of decision making. These are important and adult questions of morality and, crucially, of virtue. In the first two chapters here, J.K. Rowling has absolutely set out her stall. I don't honestly love these chapters narratively. I don't really care about Aunt Marge. The expansion of this awful, odious woman is not necessarily the most compelling, magical effect that we see in the course of Harry Potter. But it is a great inciting incident. Firstly, it works really rather well. But much more importantly, it works tonally and thematically for the rest of the book. It is a perfect beginning for the story that we're going to get. That, I think, is going to do it. Oh, yes. No, this is interesting. We're observing here in the YouTube chat that it's not Harry is not acting out of anger for himself as much as he is acting out of anger in the defense of his family. And of course, loyalty is a very important virtue. We're definitely going to see that unfold in the rest of the story too. Good. That, I think, then, is going to do it. There we go. It's almost at time. That's perfect. Let me call up the slide with our next week's reading. This is probably going to be the briefest session that we're going to have in this entire seminar series, but that's good. Next week, then, chapters 3 and 4, The Night Bus and the Leaky Cauldron. That will be Tuesday, August the 15th. You'll note that there isn't a time on this slide, and that's because we're still kind of moving things around. It will almost certainly be an evening session next week. It may be 9 o'clock Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. It may be 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. Get in touch and let me know what times are most convenient for you. We've been moving around a little bit, and for those of you who are listening to the podcast version, for those of you particularly in European time zones, there will be some afternoon sessions in the course of this third season of Dear Mr. Potter 2. I want as many people as possible to be able to come and hang out here. Yeah, look at this. 2 chapters, no time turner necessary, observes Dylan the Joel. Absolutely right. I did the thing. I've learned so much over the course of the last year. Oh, Lil0842 says, I have a question. How do you read and select the comments so fast while talking? Do you have a trick? Practice, I guess, is the answer. I've missed many comments. I know that for sure. I'm certain that I have missed some great questions, and you guys should definitely get in touch. If you have questions prior to the next session, get in touch and let me know. Traditionally, for these sessions, I will start next week's session with some thoughts on this week's session, some thoughts on the discourse that has taken place in the 7 days since. So get in touch and let me know. You can email me directly, pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter @pointnorthmedia or @paperbullets for my personal account, but use the hashtag Dear Mr. Potter, DEARMRPOTTER, and I will see those comments. Or stop by the Discord chat, which you can get access to by pledging your support over at patreon.com/pointnorthmedia. If you are eager for us to continue through the rest of the Harry Potter series, if you want this to be a full-time gig, head on over there, pledge your support. $1 a month or whatever you can afford makes all of this possible. And I am, as ever, and as sincerely as I can possibly be, so grateful for your support. That will do it this week. And we'll figure it out next week. Yes. Good. Dear Mr. Potter is the hashtag. Thanks so much for your company tonight, everyone. I look forward to talking about Harry Potter for the next week with all of you until we come back to talk about chapters 3 and 4 next week. This is the beginning of a fantastic adventure. And I was thinking about signing off, Dear Mr. Potter. Usually I just have like a kind of weak sauce sign off at the end. I just say, take care or whatever. But because this is Prisoner of Azkaban and because I have this map right behind me, I think we'll wrap up in the only way that we possibly can. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you all next week. Until then, mischief managed.